This is Relationscapes, the podcast where we explore the shifting terrain of relationships, gender, sexuality, race, and more. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guides in this episode are Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman.
Thinking about children and thinking about family is coded conservative. And so for us, one of the tasks was to call out that this connection between just the very question, should I have children, should I start a family, and other conservative points is not a necessary one.
And I'll just add that it wasn't always the case that family values was presented as a conservative issue. Many great progressive, leftist, liberal thinkers have raised the importance of family. And so it's important to carve out a space for progressives and liberals to have these conversations and not just cede them to the right.
Is anybody out there thinking about having kids right now? It's a little rough out there. Becoming a parent, though, used to be what most people seem to want. It was the path to a meaningful life. But things have changed, and a lot more people report feeling really ambivalent about kids or no kids. There are things like climate change making the future seem bleak. Finding the right partner can be tough. Many men still aren't doing their fair share of child rearing. Look at the cost of living, not to mention the terrible political moment that we're in. Why would anybody want to bring a kid into this? Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman don't want women to be the only ones wrestling with that decision. They say the choice to have kids isn't just a women's issue, it's a basic human one that we all need to think about. Their new book is called What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. And they join us right now to offer progressive ways to think about the hardest questions about having kids today. Anastasia Berg, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks for having me.
And Rachel Wiseman also joins us. Rachel, it's great to have you on the show, too.
Good to be here.
We're talking about your book, What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. And Rachel, I'll start with you because you wrote the introduction. Anastasia wrote the conclusion of the book. And your introduction starts off with your own ambivalence about whether to become a mother. All along, you kind of thought you would reach this point of knowing whether you'd want to have kids, but as you approach your 30s, you say, like, whatever that thing was that was supposed to tell you that wasn't telling you that. So talk about that context of when you started to really wonder about why you weren't wondering about this question, maybe.
Yeah, so the book starts with an introduction that I write where I reflect on being in my late 20s, early 30s, and feeling as though I was expecting at some point to have this maybe urge come over me to make the question of whether or not to have children somehow necessary and should I have kids? I had a hard time figuring out how I should raise it and how necessary it was for me to take this question really seriously. It wasn't that I was thinking about it in terms of like the rational pros and cons. Can I afford it? Do I really want them? I just didn't know where to begin. And that felt pretty isolating. So at one point I asked my mom, how did you know that you wanted to be a mom? How did you know you wanted kids? And for her, she said, well, it was obvious. I always wanted kids. There was no real moment for me where it became this big looming question because it was never really a question at all. Whereas for me and many other people, I think in our social milieu, it is this very live, real question in a way that it wasn't before. And so in the book, we try to address that and also give space for people who might feel kind of alone and isolated in the decision to figure out where they might want to begin.
And in the intro, you place your own personal story in a broader context. I mean, the basic facts are pretty clear, right? People are generally waiting longer to have kids if they have them. People are having fewer kids. And these numbers are increasing. Like the time people are waiting is longer. The number of kids is getting lower. So you're situating yourself, but you're also not really feeling like the question exists in that bigger context. It really does feel like a personal question. And you're going to look in the book about where that ambivalence comes from, to uncover the sources of that ambivalence, and then also to dig into the deeper philosophical stakes about what children are even for. Like, what does it mean to want to have kids at this time, right? So the intro really lets us know where you're at, Rachel. Anastasia, how about you? I didn't get as much from you about that calculus, like when you did that calculus, what it looked like for you. Maybe you grew up kind of like Rachel's mom, just knowing that you would always want to have kids.
So that's not the case. In the book, after the introduction, Rachel and I spent 4 chapters discussing the sources of ambivalence, so many romantic concerns, feminist concerns, especially for women, and the ethical concerns that are brought home by climate change today. But I conclude with a little report from, quote unquote, the other side, having had a child. And what is it that I have personally to say to people who are faced with a decision? In my case, no, I did not always want to have kids. And in fact, for me, what was very salient was the fact that for novelists, poets, and philosophers who were women, it looked like a condition of their success and creativity and productivity that they shouldn't have children. And this is partly because there's a kind of kick out of listing all the women who didn't have kids in order to make just this point. We see far less frequently the list of women who, in fact, did have children and succeeded just as much or more. And so for me, it was very clear that this is a sacrifice I'm going to have to make in order to be able to write a book about an important philosophical question like I just did. So as to what changed, I think, and I want to credit philosophy for it, although I wasn't asking the question of children in a philosophical register, I was thinking a lot about the role of different values in human life, the differences in how we live today from how we lived in the past, what we lost, what we can recover, what we want to reinvent. And I think at some point I realized that I want to take a direct part in this project of the perpetuation of human life in a direct way. I call it taking one for Team Humanity. I didn't have kids because I thought they would be just fun. I didn't do it just because I wanted to ethically grow or see the world from the perspective of a child's eyes. I really thought it's going to be hard. It's going to make harder accomplishing all these things that I don't think I'm going to care about less. And indeed, I do not care about less now that I have children. But this difficulty is something that we collectively share. And I'm willing to do my little part, like I do as a citizen or like I do as part of an academic community. I'm going to take my little part, me and my partner, in taking care of this one tiny droplet of the next generation.
You've hit on a lot of things that I'm excited to talk about. The basic stories that people tell about why people are having fewer kids and why people feel ambivalent about it. They include things like economic uncertainty, the rise of women's empowerment, and concerns about climate change, and all these things that we'll dig into. But before we do, I also wanted to point out that this book about ambivalence, I approached it with some of my own ambivalence. And my own ambivalence, this sort of uncertainty or maybe even some little fears about the cultural war that's going on about these questions, right? These are very loaded questions about whether people should have kids or why people should want to or don't want to. So I wanted to ask you about that, if that was on your mind as you approach this. The things that I'm thinking about are debates over abortion. People that oppose abortion are probably more likely to make pro-natalist arguments, or the racist things that can happen with conversations around birth. The great replacement theory is an example of this. The idea that not enough white people are reproducing, they're being out-reproduced by other races, and that could lead to the downfall of society or whatever. So I wanted to know how you thought about those kind of hot button culture war issues as you approach doing this book.
Well, the first, maybe most interesting point there's to make here is that the polarization and politicization of the question of children is, in fact, one of the reasons we think it's so hard to think about them, especially in liberal and progressive circles, because thinking about children and thinking about family is coded conservative. So it's something that's supposed to happen without you directing too much attention to directly. As we might talk about, that's also true from other perspectives, but it's very true from this ethical political perspective that you raise. And so for us, one of the tasks was to call out that this connection between just the very question, should I have children, should I start a family, and other conservative points is not a necessary one. We want to free ourselves from this impossibility of having an open conversation about whether it's fertility timelines, something very much coded conservative, or the benefits of family or the meaning of motherhood and fatherhood from the pressures, the political pressures. This is why we published the New York Times op-ed about freeing or saving children from the culture wars. And I'll just add that I actually think there's tremendous potential for liberals and progressives to find something in common with conservatives and religious conservatives through this question of children. Because if you look at the kind of things that progressives and liberals care about, the kind of reform they want to see in the world, all those things presuppose a robust human future that I think we should free more people to want to, as I was saying before, take a direct part in.
And I'll just add that it wasn't always the case that family values was something that was presented as a conservative issue. Democrats and Republicans used to fight over which party could really claim that title. And many great progressive, leftist, liberal thinkers of the past have raised the importance of family as a kind of haven from all of these market forces that make life very difficult for people. And so I think it's important to carve out a space for progressives and liberals to have these conversations and not just cede them to the right in the way that they have.
I appreciated in the beginning of the book seeing you openly acknowledge, like, yeah, there's racist discussions that happen around these issues. That's not what we're doing. Like, you made sure to take it into account and let people know where you were coming from, to try to back away from the ways that culture war uses these issues and to just be more thoughtful about it. So that, for me, the ambivalence sort of lifted. I was like, okay, cool. Like, I'm excited to see what else you do in the book. And you start off with looking at the externals, the reasons that people are going to give about maybe why they feel ambivalent or maybe even don't want to have kids. And Rachel, you talk about how you found this course by Ann Davidman, this online thing, Motherhood, Is It For Me? And it's something that people can subscribe to for guided meditations and writing exercises. And there's an online forum and phone calls. And the point of all of it is to get a person to tune out all external considerations and just listen inside themselves to find out if they personally really want to have kids, if this is important to them. And it kind of presupposes the idea that you can be this isolated person, this sort of platonic little thing inside you that can tell you whether or not you want to have kids or not. And in the chapter on externals, you point out that's difficult to do. That's kind of problematic.
Yeah. So one of the premises of the course is that there's some kind of internal desire that you can discover if you only are able to separate out all of these other factors that might be clouding your decision making in the moment, right? Like your partner's preferences about kids, or what your parents want for you, or your career, or whether you're biologically capable of having them. And what my experience of the class was, and I think, in talking to other people who also took it, we felt like, okay, well, it is kind of liberating to be able to silence those things for a minute. But at the same time, they're the substance of your life. They are the things that you will always have to return an answer to. So we felt that it was important to be able to sort of peel back those concerns about career and romance and, family and climate to figure out what really is going on under the surface there and why it is that it's so hard for people to figure out how to act and what to do in light of those concerns.
Right. I feel like we can't fully separate ourselves from those externals. I think we're already thrown into a world where they make us who we are and where they contribute to our decision making. And so you're going to talk about some of the things that people list in polls when it comes up why people are delaying having kids or not having kids at all. And there's some big ones. And let's talk about those for a minute here, the externals that people identify that affect their decision on this. The first one we'll talk about is economic precarity. This is a factor, you say, but you also suggest it might not be as big of a factor as people have come to believe.
So the answer here is twofold. No doubt, especially in the American context, financial considerations, which means concerns with money and career, loom large. However, the situation is complicated once we start looking at international comparisons. In particular, when we look at countries who ostensibly have removed precisely those obstacles that people list. So countries like the Nordics and South Korea, where we have universal health care, childcare, generous maternity leave, we see that we do not have the intended or the sought out effects on the birth rates. Now, in raising this, we do not mean to debunk the explanation and simply, call it out as a case of bad faith. We treat this complication as an invitation to think deeper into what is going on when people are raising these concerns. And what we found is that they may not speak to actual concerns with affordability of children. What we have with millennials in particular is that unlike their characterization as immature and refusing to grow up, lazy, histrionic, in fact, there's something too mature, too adult about them, because what they have is a conception of the standards of readiness for family. And these are standards that you see across both financial and professional life, but also romantically and also in terms of their personal constitution, that are so high and so vague, one never knows whether one has reached them. And it's this, we think that the frequent talk about the concern and the anxiety over finances, careers, really points to that concern, the concern of whether I will ever be ready enough.
Right. And so it's, as you point out, these programs in other countries, for example, paid childcare and things like this, there are strong cases to make for why we should do that, but maybe immediately affecting the birth rate might not be one of those. They're better for the social good in general, yeah, but it might not affect the exact numbers.
Exactly. And if I may just add to that point, in fact, today we have a situation, particularly among liberals and progressives, where we're pushing for certain kind of policy we'd like to see. Universal health care, and then more specifically, mandatory parental leave and childcare. However, while we're refusing to take a hard stance on the question of the value of children and family. So it's not only that we think that these programs are good for another reason, we actually think that in order to really full-throatedly advocate for them, we need to begin by having the courage and possibility to affirm the value of children.
Right. And that's going to get complicated when people start bringing up the state of the world itself, which we'll talk about later on, when people are worried about things like climate change and that sort of thing. And we will get to that. Another external that you mentioned here is general purpose of life stuff. I mean, when people are polled, they talk about wanting a satisfying career, about having leisure time and being able to enjoy their lives and all of that. And some people think that accounts for ambivalence and chalk it up to a rise in a selfish culture.
So a couple things we didn't list in that list, Blair, is that people also talk about wanting to invest in their friendships. They talk about wanting to, quote, make the world a better place. So the quick assumption that all we have here is just more selfishness, I think, is something we should be a little careful about. And by the way, that, of course, is itself a conservative talking point. What we found is that more profoundly, the big, most fundamental change is not in people becoming necessarily more selfish, nor is it in children simply becoming more costly, but that's the very role of children in a human life has drastically changed. So in the past, children were understood to be a very part of the framework of human life. It is something that you did no matter what the cost would be or whether or not it would give you any benefit. Today, however, it's a open question that people feel the pressure to justify. So as opposed to saying, oh, the opportunity cost of children has risen, really the change is so much more radical. It's that now we see them through the lens of an opportunity cost. And when we look at how children are perceived, it's not just that they're one choice among others, but that we see them often marking the end of life as you knew it. They're understood to be, especially for women, completely potentially transformative of one's identity. And partly because people also having them so late, they're thinking my kids are going to leave my house when I'm mid-50s and in the 60s. I'll never get to enjoy the things that I have enjoyed and understand myself through. So instead of thinking of the self becoming more dear, is that children is understood as much more of a threat to that self as opposed to continuous with a life that we are going to be living in our future.
Right. And then another external is the issue of finding a partner. A lot of people, when they think about having kids, want to do that in relationship with a partner. They don't. Some people are cool doing it alone, but a lot of people aren't. And relationships and how they're formed and how they progress has also changed over time. And now you say parenthood's kind of seen more as a capstone rather than a stepping stone or part of that process. So people want to find a partner. then go through a courtship and like dating and like get to know each other, and then maybe later on get married, and then figure out what marriage is like, and then later on maybe have kids. And so that part of the decision is getting more and more delayed. Again, because some people are just want a relationship that's working and stable, and again, they just really want to be sure in something. And so that's contributing to children being postponed or even just completely sort of pushed off to the side.
Right. There's this new kind of dating paradigm that's taken priority today called slow love, right? So in contrast to the kind of stereotype about millennial hookup culture, in fact, millennials are taking much longer to commit. They're testing the waters for longer. They're dating online, sometimes for a long time before they even meet. And what's really remarkable is that people feel, whereas in the past, it was kind of understood that you would date sort of in view to finding a partner to start a family with. Now, it's more common for people to feel that I have to find the perfect, most compatible partner first, and then we can begin broaching the topic of whether or not we want to have children. So there's a real separation of the romantic timeline from the family timeline.
That's Rachel Wiseman, and she is the managing editor of The Point and a co-author of the book we're talking about today, What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. And we're also talking with Anastasia Berg, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. Okay, so you got together and you decided to write this book, and you asked each other personal questions about motherhood and had kind of a friendship there. And you also turned to history and sociology and literature and film and interviewed contemporary women and men about their feelings about this. And your book's going to look at the history of feminism in particular to help us understand where we're at today. And you say there are feminisms. There's no single feminism. And it's really clear when it comes to discussions around motherhood, because having children has controlled so much of a woman's life that feminism has sort of been divided over this question, or wrestling with this question about abolishing it altogether or finding a way to reconceive it in ways that empower women more. So give us some example of those different schools of feminism about the let's just get rid of it altogether. It's an oppressive thing. It hurts women versus, hey, let's like re-envision what this could be and maybe embrace it as like the best thing women can do, which is also, sort of these polar views, and then feminisms that fall in between that.
Yeah. So interestingly, you can see both poles of that debate in one of the seminal texts of feminism in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. She wanted to liberate women from the confines of their physiological destiny, from the home, and give them the freedom to enter public life. At the same time, she recognized just how central children and raising another human being was to the continuation of human life and ethical life, and what a serious ethical task it was. And then for the feminists who followed her, there was this sort of more pro-motherhood camp of feminism that felt that motherhood could be a source of great power and meaning for women. It just needed to have the conditions changed, and it indeed could be even universalized. The values of motherhood could be universalized, and men could adopt them too. And then on the other side, there were feminists who felt that motherhood was in some ways a prison that was the source of most of women's oppression. So that you could see kind of typified by, Shulamith Firestone in The Dialectic of Sex, who thought that the sexual division as such was what was keeping women down. And it was only when, mechanical wombs were invented and the sex division was exploded that women would be truly free. And so you see that these debates went on for a long time about the importance of motherhood to a human life. And by the 1980s, they kind of exhausted themselves. And so as a result, what both sides could agree on was essentially the value of private individual choice. That is, if you want kids, have them. If you don't want them, don't have them. But everyone else should just kind of keep quiet. And feminism kind of moved on to other things. But that left a real vacuum in the public conversation, such that a lot of women don't have these conceptual resources to think through whether they should have kids and why it might be something that they would want to take on or what it would mean for them.
And perhaps I'll just add, because you also asked Blair about what's happening in between. We think that some of the most interesting positions in this debate are not occupied at the polls, but are in fact occupied by people like Bell Hooks, who basically said that we should overcome a situation where the question of children is a feminist one, i.e. a women's issue. So part of the essential problem is that we're asking, are kids good for women or are kids not good for women? Instead of asking and recognizing that the responsibility of having children should be truly equally shared. And if that's the case, we should start thinking about parenthood, not just about motherhood.
And you say it makes sense that someone like Bell Hooks, a really incredible philosopher and theorist and just a great writer, you say it's interesting that she pointed this out because for Black women, the debates in the 60s about like women entering the workforce kind of seemed beside the point because that was more of like a white woman's concern about we want to be in the workforce. Meanwhile, a lot of Black women are like, we've been here all along. Like, what are you all talking about? Like,
exactly
the kind of empowerment you're looking for. So talk about how like race became a really important component in challenging white feminism and kind of the limitations of what white feminism was trying to do.
Well, you said most of it, Blair. Because of the class distinctions between races in America, Black feminists were much more attuned to the situation of the working class woman. Bell Hooks herself says what I'm saying is true of Black working class women. It is in fact true of white working class women too, which is they've always been working. So the obsession with liberating women into the workforce as the exclusive goal misses not just the fact that they've always been already there out in the workforce, but also the fact that for those women, having children and family was in fact one of the refuges from the dehumanizing work that they were subjected to. So that was a realm of free human affect and of humanizing labor, as Bell Hooks puts it. And so she, from that perspective, is able to point out what then ends up being true also of a lot of middle-class women who go into the workforce, which is perhaps all their quest for meaning and value in their life is not being met by their desk jobs. And so she calls on us to reevaluate precisely this polarity. She calls out both the complete anti-motherhood feminists because they are, she says, sort of ethically missing an important part of what it means to be women at the time, but also pragmatically, she says you're losing the vote of these women. And she's calling out pro-motherhood, which she says, well, this is well-intentioned, but in fact, it's sentimentalist, it's essentializing, it's oftentimes quite class-blind because it's coming from middle and upper middle-class white women who did get to enjoy their motherhood as very empowering and beautiful. And she's calling on us to rethink it. She draws a lot explicitly on Adrienne Rich, and she says, we need to rethink how we're socializing the youngest kids vis-a-vis parenthood. And we shouldn't be calling the little boy caring for his doll motherly. We should be lauding him as a good parent. And once we, from the earliest age, model equal parenting, encourage equal parenting, that's how we're going to really transform the gender differentiation insofar as it's harming us. So to go back to Firestone, who wants to explode that difference, she says, no, we're going to transform it by inculcating the sense that family, nurture of children, care of children, and education, these are things that can bring meaning to the life of all people, not just women.
I love how you bring Bell Hooks into the conversation because another thing I want to amplify that you referred to is this rise of sort of mysticism and like motherhood is this idealized state. So part of the feminist movement was like feminism and women are amazing. Look what our bodies do. Look how amazing birth is and like breastfeeding and natural birth and all of these things, which can be really positive in some people's lives. But again, as you mentioned, like Bell Hooks is pointing out that kind of romanticizes things. And also that can be used to argue that is a women's job and men are over here. The whole division of like men provide and hunt and gather, and women are over here nurturing and doing the baby stuff. And Bell Hooks is saying we should also pay attention to that kind of romanticizing of motherhood and say parenthood should be more salient than motherhood and fatherhood. And she really wants to end the contest between women that was happening. Like women would say being a mother is the most important thing a woman could do, or it's women who say being a mother is the most rewarding thing in my life. And Bell says, okay, why can't we just say being a mother is important to me, or being a mother has been so rewarding to me? why do we have to make it into a contest? She wants to kind of get rid of that contest element too, so that we're not, some people can't have kids, or some people, maybe they don't want them. How can we change our views of what motherhood is to be more encompassing of more of humanity is kind of what I see her doing. And the irony in all of that is today, it wouldn't be surprising to see an op-ed that says, I want to have kids and I love having kids, but society hates that, or I feel persecuted, or I feel really judged for wanting to do that. Then you can also see an op-ed of a woman saying, I feel so much pressure to have kids. Culture is like making me do it and I don't want to. And we could see both of those perspectives being truly held by two different women. So talk about that context that we're seeing today of like either the world is making women have kids still, or it's the world doesn't want us to have kids now.
The first thing to say is, of course, this is a culturally unresolved issue. We have, in fact, people both concerned about declining birth rates, mostly conservatives, and making a big fuss about it. And we also have people worried about climate, women's rights, etc., who are weary of motherhood and channeling that sentiment. What's interesting, however, in addition, is that we have, and we found in our many interviews with women and men, is that because this choice today is so fraught, people feeling the real need to justify it, we think also a lot of times they're, I would say, given their internal conflict, whichever way they're leaning, they're really acutely aware of pressures from the other direction. So women who are very ambivalent or leaning no are seeing the world as full of signs that they have to have children. Although a lot of times when you ask them, okay, so you experience external pressure, what form does it take? They really have nothing more to point to than my mother-in-law asked me about it. On the other hand, women who are, of course, free to have kids are looking at the culture. They're looking at that monthly op-ed about climate change in the New York Times. If they're in an academic or culturally kind of avant-garde milieu, they might be also directly exposed to more feminist kind of pressures that, can't find room for family in the life of an intellectually ambitious, artistically inclined woman. And those are the things that are salient to them. And I would say part of the ambition of the book is to create more of a possibility of hashing out exactly these questions. Like Rachel was saying, this isn't considered a mainstay of feminist debates today. Other things are on the table. We want to bring it back on the table so that women and men who are conflicted have somewhere to turn and think with.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think the identity dimension of the motherhood question complicates things even further, because then people see it as a direct threat or indictment of who they are, whether or not they made this decision, I'm going to be a mom, I'm not going to be a mom, I'm going to be child-free. Mm-hmm. And so those identity challenges can feel so intense that any kind of different approach or an article in an op-ed or something like that can be seen as an actual calling out of the legitimacy of their own choices. And we think that it's important for feminists to be able to create room in the public conversation where we can talk about these different kinds of experiences without that kind of defensiveness. And that in the past, feminists were really able to think about what are the difficulties that women are experiencing in their lives psychologically, and to try to address those and come up with solutions. And it's, if we're not willing to see those honestly and have those conversations, then there won't necessarily be the resources to help women overcome them.
Right. What you're pointing out in the book is that feminism isn't a checklist of predetermined set of goals for women, but it's an evolving movement, and it needs to respond to challenges as they emerge in ways that address women with multiple options. And importantly, that's not just about women.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Sure.
Okay, so men. What about men?
In progressive and liberal circles, the understanding that women should have control over their bodies, that they should be able to shape the course of their lives, has given way to what we think is an unfortunate consequence, where the very burden of the decision, this very fraught decision, as we've been talking, has been completely lifted off the shoulders of men. Because their pressures are on men, precisely those men who understand themselves as quote unquote allies, i.e., as supportive of women and their empowerment, to take a big back step from the questioning of parenting. Men we've talked to and asked about entering conversations about parenting have told us that they would absolutely prefer not to do so because they would be perceived as creepy, controlling, and oppressive. Now, again, we have a good intention here, but what happens in practice? What happens in practice is that women within relationships are left with this choice on their own. We joke to say the answer, whatever you want, honey, is one you don't want to hear in response to the question, what are we going to have for dinner, or what are we going to watch tonight? That's certainly not an answer you want to hear to the question, do you want to have kids with me? And so what we need is to strike a very delicate balance where we both encourage men to think about this question early, to interrogate their own desire as to what shape they really want their lives to take, and enter into those conversations, freeing women to partake in them without, of course, those acts of thinking and speech putting undue pressure on women. We think this is something that's certainly possible and that we need to see a lot more today. And just to make it clear, we have an understanding that men should be doing as much around the house. However, in thinking that the responsibility for the question of having children is something that doesn't belong to men, we're in a way, we're stacking the deck against the equal participation of men and women in the household, because when you're not making the decision, you're not taking responsibility for it later.
Right. Hey, you're the one that wanted to have kids, so I'm here to be an accessory to that project rather than a full co-partner is kind of the mindset that sets us up for.
Exactly. The history of feminism teaches us that feminist commitments point beyond themselves, right? That it's not the case that women can solve all of these problems, just within the framework of individual choice or just within, a women's discourse. That most of the feminist concerns at their core are human ones. And so that requires the participation of all people, men, women, all genders.
That's Rachel Wiseman. She and Anastasia Berg are authors of the book, What Are Children For? All right, so after taking readers through theoretical feminist thought, kind of a history of feminism in the 20th century, you also look at some popular books by women who are wrestling with the question of whether to have kids. And I think this is really great because I think people are probably more likely to read a memoir or something than they are to dig into deep philosophical texts. So as you kind of did a literature review and looked at some of these memoirs, what kind of patterns did you notice in these books about motherhood?
Yeah. So in these motherhood ambivalence novels, there are a few tropes that get repeated. One is that a kind of very intense focus on pregnancy and the first year of postpartum parenthood, motherhood. Another is a very kind of detailed account of the physical experience of pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding. But the novels present this picture of motherhood that is quite generally negative. You get a lot of emphasis on the things that are challenging biologically, psychologically, and not a lot of a kind of fuller sense of the pleasures and goodness of being a parent, partly because of that kind of myopic focus on those very, very intense, physically demanding months and years. There's also a tendency to view the child as a kind of alien figure. So they're often kind of presented as either a bomb that blows up your life, or a literal extraterrestrial, or an animal like a cougar or something that has somehow appeared in your life, and not as something that's continuous with a full human existence. It's not really so much redeemed on its own terms. So that's one kind of branch of the motherhood ambivalence genre that we talk about. But then there are others too, like Elena Ferrante in The Lost Daughter, or in her Neapolitan Quartet, and then Tori Peters, who we think do actually succeed in presenting motherhood not in a particularly rosy way, but in kind of dramatizing really what's at stake in choosing to become a mother or a parent.
It seems like there must have been a shift there because as you talk about people airing the negativity or really processing the difficult parts about it, maybe that was kind of new where before women were really expected to say how wonderful motherhood was and how incredible it was. And so that shift in genre, could be kind of a reaction to earlier expectations or maybe even present expectations that every woman needs to just love this. So it would be bad for women to say how sucky it is because they're supposed to be natural at this. And so maybe these books are sort of a reflection of, okay, I'm going to actually tell you the truth here. Here's what it is.
It's very true, Blair, that the novels perform something new, which is they make a worthy literary subject out of the experience of motherhood, where the whole focus of the entire memoir or novel is the experience of motherhood. But I think there's a tendency to exaggerate how new, in fact, that is. In fact, in literature and in film, we've always had the acknowledgement that not all women are natural mothers and not all experiences of motherhood are rosy ones. And Rachel and I actually have tried to think quite hard about what is this investment in the novelty of that discovery when looking historically, it's not that novel. This isn't an actual big revelation. And what we found was that there is a constant need and desire to try and express why motherhood is so difficult, why it's so challenging. And I think some of it is specific to women and some of it is just the difficulty of integrating children, family life into a human life. Some of it is the sort of not insurmountable, but seemingly insurmountable ethical challenges of having children, especially today in the light of climate change. And I think the most fundamentally, it's really this kind of awesome task of taking responsibility for another human life. And so I think all of these kind of fears and anxieties get invested and channeled through the idea that this is in fact sort of a groundbreaking literary discovery where the truth is, I'm not sure it is.
That's interesting. You still point out, though, that a lot of them are very individual focused. So a lot of them are in the head of the mother, right? And it's the mom and the baby. There's not a lot of community. There's not a lot of moments where they're talking about how great it is to have a kid or the benefits of having a kid. But you do point out an exception to this in Tori Peters's novel, Detransition Baby. And this is a really fascinating example of thinking about motherhood in a new novel. So talk about Detransition Baby and how that fits into the story you're telling.
Yeah, so Detransition Baby takes a very different sort of stylistic approach from the more traditional motherhood ambivalence novels. It is in some ways a more conventional novel because there are, instead of it being just this very hyper-subjective experience of one kind of disembodied character who is undergoing the transition from not being a mother to being a mother, it's really an investigation of the question, should we become mothers? And the way that it does that is by staging this confrontation between these three characters. So there's this character, Ames, who used to be trans, used to be living as a trans woman and then detransitioned and has been living as a man, but still has a great deal of gender dysphoria. Who enters a relationship with his boss, a cis hetero woman, and they accidentally get pregnant, and they have to decide, are we going to keep this child? The woman who is carrying the child is pretty ambivalent about the idea of having a baby. Ames wants to maybe become a parent, but the idea of being a father is very alienating and kind of triggers his gender dysphoria in another way. And so he says, I can do this if I bring in this past flame of mine, who is a trans woman who has always loved children and has always felt that motherhood was the one kind of marker of female identity that was not available to her. And so by kind of going through these three different kinds of accounts of what it would mean to take on the mantle of motherhood or parenthood, you get to see really what's at stake for each of these characters and also what might potentially be good or redeemable about the experience.
There's a passage that you include in the book that I wanted to read here. You say, of all the motherhood ambivalence narratives that you discuss in the book, none of them have a passage that's so straightforward about a desire to be a mother. So I'll read that here. This is from the character called Reese, who's asked, why do you specifically want to have a baby? And this is the response. There are so many reasons, but most of them are so simple, so embodied that they feel inadequate to the question. She likes to hold children, to smell a baby's hair, to soothe a crying infant and feel his little frame let go of rigid fear, to settle in her arms. The weight goes slack and calm so that for a moment she both gives and receives a rare peace. To rock a baby and communicate with your body, you're safe. When she worked at the daycare, she liked the thoughtless way a child would reach to take her hand. She liked watching kids puzzle out something new, their wonder, their awe and excitement, which was, when she let it be, contagious. She liked their sudden acts of altruism. She recalled this one kid at the daycare, maybe 4 years old, who built a tower out of blocks, then tugged on her sleeve with the offer, "Do you want to kick it down?" He understood that the knockdown was the best part of building, and he wanted to give it to her. Who else could give you something so pure but a child? Anastasia, when you're hearing that passage, what's going through your mind?
Well, what struck us in reading it was just the willingness and even courage to speak in such unadorned ways about the satisfaction, attraction, and pleasures of being a parent. And after having read the motherhood ambivalence novels, where, as Rachel was describing, there is a desire to capture something by way of why would anyone choose this experience? But it's never in terms of the mundane, quotidian, ordinary aspects of parenting. It's always done through some form of sublimation or another. And so there's just something so refreshing in someone willing to speak for the experience in just such a straightforward and kind of something like, I don't know, it's like a relief to be able to experience that on the page. And of course, partly that's made possible because in the polyphony of voices that Peters uses, it's not a single voice, it's not just a single consciousness kind of ruminating over the experience again and again and again. In having the trans woman talk about why she wants to be a child, she is sort of invited and opened to expressing that desire in these in these kind of straightforward, simple ways where you can almost say, if I kind of dare, that against the background of this kind of portrayal, there's something anxious about the ambivalence literature mother's portrayal of motherhood. Like they won't dare to just say there is something that's lovely about this moment. By the way, and this is a connection we haven't drawn before, so you get an original there. If you think about the Ferrante and the Lost Daughter, she talks about how this simple moment of peeling the orange for her children, that becomes the kind of moment that she plays and replays and becomes, it symbolizes the love that she has for the daughters, the reason why she comes back, and really her capacity of integrating her love for the children into her love of herself, which is what makes it possible for her to come back and assume her role as a mother. So again, a daily occurrence that she can find the meaning and value in, as opposed to some attempt to, talk about parenting. Like we hear, it's going to put you in touch with another realm. It's going to be a portal to tremendous ethical growth. You're going to be assuming some new transformative identity.
Right, and she's just enjoying peeling an orange. Rachel, when you hear a passage like that, you don't have children now. Does that kind of stuff pull at your heart? Like, what are you feeling inside? Do you feel like books could make a difference in the kind of decisions you end up making?
Yeah, well, I think that literature is a incredibly potent arena of, exploring meaning. I don't think it can be a guide. I don't think it can give you specific answers as to whether or not you want X or Y, but it can kind of lay out and dramatize through these characters and their experiences what really is at the heart of some of these big questions about what it means to live. And it can do so in a way that, theory or philosophy maybe can't. That said, when I read Ferrante or Tori Peters, what I get out of it is a sort of liberating sense of parenthood as a meaningful and constituent part of a human life.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's easy. That's not to say that one has to take it on. Notably, in Detransition Baby, sorry if this is a spoiler, it ends in an abortion. So it's not necessarily like the thing that you have to take on as your own, but it presents parenthood as something that could be a worthy project.
And if I may, I would also add that what's interesting about Ferrante and Detransition Baby is that you have this staging of a conversation about parenthood between either people who are thinking of doing it together or not. And that intersubjective experience becomes very important for whatever decision making is happening, what the progression of the plot, etc., in a way that's very absent from the prevalent motherhood ambivalence literary genre, where you have very few conversations with other people, and whatever conversations you feel like they're like a little collage, they're little markers, but they're not life constituting moments, if that makes sense. They don't propel the drama. There is no drama. And so that fact really mirrors something that's really important in the book for us, which is creating a space for open and free conversation about the role of parenthood, especially in the lives of progressives and liberals, which we feel we just don't have enough of. And so that's another thing that we really liked about these particular novels.
I loved reading about the novels. I hadn't read any of them, but it really made me want to read Detransition Baby, which was already on my list. So I think I'm going to bump that up. And yeah, that was a big spoiler, Rachel, but I'll forgive you.
Sorry.
So a lot of these books are talking about, no, it's cool. A lot of these books are talking about whether it's right for an individual, right? Is this right for me, for my life? The next part of your book broadens that question to whether having kids in this world could be right in general. And Anastasia, you mentioned climate change. This is often cited as a reason people might not want to have kids right now. Things are looking ecologically dangerous. Or people use climate change to explain declining birth rates. But you point out in the book that this isn't the first time in history that parents have been worried about large-scale catastrophes and whether they should have kids. You cite an example from 100 years ago with Virginia Woolf. She has a character in a novel who says, one cannot bring children into a world like this. One cannot perpetuate suffering. And so you could read that 100 years ago. You could read that today, right? But you even trace it back to ancient history, the question of whether it's morally right to bring children into this existence at all. And you identify this anti-natalist thinking, this against having babies thinking, and you identify two major impulses behind it. There's the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. So let's look at both of those in turn, beginning with the problem of evil. What is that, and what does it have to do with whether we should have kids or not?
So the problem of evil is the following challenge. Could it be that human life is so fallen, that's in a theological register, or simply so bad and evil, we're so cruel, we're so selfish in a secular register, that it would be irresponsible to bring more human life, whether because of the damage we cause one another or the damage we cause to the planet?
Yeah, like, would I want to bring my kid into this idea that things are so bad and people do such bad things that I don't want to take part in that or put someone into that? How do you answer that problem of evil? How did you explore it, to contextualize it, to work through it with people who are worrying about the problem of evil?
Right. I will point out in what you said, you actually also hear echoes of the problem of suffering, and it's worthwhile putting both on the table, because a lot of times when we talk about climate change, we can actually slide from one to the other. The problem of suffering is the problem perhaps a bit more familiar, which is how can we bring children into a world like this, and into a world and to the world as we predict it to become. Now, once we've diagnosed the arguments, we are able to answer them. And there are two different answers to the argument from evil and argument from suffering. I'll start with the argument from evil. The argument from evil says we're irredeemable, right? Now, there's no denying that we are not perfect, to say the least, that we make mistakes, that we hurt one another, that we make errors individually and collectively.
That we give spoilers in podcasts.
That's right. And what we invite our readers to ask is whether or not they cannot recognize in their own lives the pursuit of goals and projects and attempts to realize values that are in fact in their eyes of unconditional worth. So is it true? That's not something I can answer for someone else, but is it true that your life is all shadow? You know, you read an eco-lit novel, you pick up a climate change novel off the shelf, and you get a picture of us as decrepit and selfish and, you know, completely ineffectual. And the question is that really how you see yourself? I think even the authors of these novels don't see ourselves that way because they write the books for us. You know, they can see past that perspective. They wrote the book. They think we can see past that perspective because they think we'll like the book. And I think once we ask ourselves that question, we realize that we're not all selfish. We're not just, you know, chasing real estate. We're trying to create homes. We're not just using one another. We're developing friendships. We're not just caring for number one. We care for political and ethical causes. From that perspective, I think the argument from evil doesn't take off the ground. Yes, we're not perfect. Yes, our pursuit of the good is partial and attenuated. But it is also, we recognize in recognition of goodness in our own lives that it is in fact possible for us to do good. And that means to do better. Now, once we put the argument from evil to one side, we are left with the argument from suffering. And here, what we want to do is actually draw out a consequence of what looks like pretty sound logic, right? So people saying, I don't want to subject someone else to a miserable fate. It seems like I'm not morally justified in doing so. These people that I'm bringing into the world didn't choose it after all. And at that point, we want to point out that this line of thinking is underground by a certain kind of assumption. And that's the assumption that we're morally responsible for the suffering that our child will have in a way over and above every other cause for that suffering or misfortune. So in addition to all the people who are mean to a person, all the systems that betray us politically, in addition to our collective negligence vis-a-vis climate change, the parent is over and above that individually responsible for all that tragedy, misfortune, failure, etc. And this is flawed. What we want to point out to is that in taking responsibility and becoming a parent, we're not responsible for every aspect of the well-being of our child. What we're responsible for is preparing that child for any kind of fate that they may encounter. We fail when we fail to prepare our child to face the inevitable pains, failures, loss, and grief that are a inevitable part of our lives as finite beings. And another thing to point out is that if we get too attracted by the idea that, the more climate change in particular gives us a reason not to have children, well, we start to see that, in fact, some people are in far better position to spare their children certain kind of harms. In a world, you can predict that your child is less likely to suffer the harms of climate change and, in fact, many other kind of harms, whether natural or man-made. And if you follow through that logic, it will then come to quickly seem like the more well-to-do you are, the more morally justified you are in having children. And that is what we call a perverse conclusion. It's perverse to apply that kind of logic that gives more moral permissibility to those who are well-to-do in having children, as if somebody who is having children under conditions of great adversity is doing something that's less responsible, when in fact, I think our common intuition that they're probably much more courageous because they're taking on that responsibility of preparing their child for what's to come under far more precarious conditions, which means also at a far greater cost, probably to oneself.
You mentioned that there's a philosopher, Jonathan Lear, who said that there's cultural pressure right now to feel anxiety about the future, and that there's a sort of cool detachment that despair can fuel. Like there's this genre of apocalyptic literature, and I've enjoyed some of it myself. Station 11 is terrific. I loved the series, the TV series that they did from it. So I enjoy this as well. But you're also worried that some of these cultural products can prompt resignation or really rob us of hope. But the response to that would be, well, what are you really going to hope for anyway then? Like, people say things look bad enough to them that they think you're kind of off your rocker if you think we should be striving toward hope in the face of possible suffering. How would you respond to that the idea that why are you so hopeful? Actually, maybe you're just burying your head in the sand here.
I don't think that having genuine hope requires burying one's head in the sand. I think having hope does require something that's not always obvious in today's discourse. Sometimes you see people talk about hope and they say something like, yeah, we're terrible. The world is a horrible, horrible place. However, who knows what the future will bring, so we can have hope. I think that kind of hope, it doesn't really make sense to me. And if we are, in fact, the creatures that are described by this kind of portrayal, then I don't know that we deserve the kind of efforts that would be required to bring about a better future. And it doesn't sound like we're capable of it. So I think a hope has to be grounded, like I was saying before, in the capacity to see goodness in our future. I often say that an evaluation of the possibility of a human future really is an evaluation of the present. So when we're talking about antinatalism, a lot of times that really is an expression of a judgment about today's reality. None of it requires burying your head in the sand, however. It's in fact the capacity to recognize that we both deserve and are capable of the kind of efforts that we're talking about to bringing about a better future that I think is necessary in order to keep your head out of the sand. Because the truth is, and I'm sorry in advance, Blair, I know you like the books and some of them are, they're a great ride, but they themselves could be a kind of way of burying your head in the sand. There's something, and that's what I think we draw on Jonathan Lear's work. There could be something self-indulgent in consuming these kind of self-flagellating accounts over and over again. Because in a way, we are invited to place ourselves out of the radius of humanity, right? We are the judges of these kind of lowly, disgusting, decrepit beings, instead of realizing that, in fact, the actual survivors of any kind of apocalypse, they're going to be people like us. They're going to be flawed. One of the things we want to encourage in the book is to recover the sense of true ambivalence, which is, the recognition of the ability to recognize both the problem and faults in our own being, as well as the tremendous potential and goodness.
I appreciated toward the end of the book where you're talking about, instead of just asking like, why have kids, you kind of expanded out to, what are we doing anything for? Like, why do anything? And when you connect it to that, sometimes some people live toward the future and sometimes people say we need to live toward the present. There's this kind of rise of Buddhist mentality of like, just live in this moment and this moment is what matters and stop thinking about the future. Where do you come down on that question in terms of where we set our horizons? Should people, as they're thinking about kids, be thinking about the horizon or like the future of human civilization and what it would take to either prevent it from falling off a cliff or to keep it flourishing versus, I like peeling this orange for my kid. In this moment, this matters to me. Where do you come down on that, setting your horizons, future or present?
Well, I think we don't think that they're so separate. That in trying to affirm the value of a human future, we are always affirming the value of the lives that we're living today. And so when, it's not just a matter of, having children for some like far off future progeny that you will never meet, although that it may be important, but to see the lives that we're living as worth reproducing, worth passing on, worth sacrificing for, and that these things are not necessarily so incompatible or so foreign as we might think.
And also following the philosopher Sam Scheffler, we point out that in many of the investment that may seem at first glance to be very presentist, in fact, we have a deep investment in a future. When I say a future, I mean the kind of future where people will outlive us. So, I'm an academic in my day job. I ostensibly am part of a big project of expanding human knowledge. If you told me there is no human future, we might really ask a question about the full sense making of this particular activity. I assume that there will be a future, and I affirm the value of that future in my action. When people are fighting for political reform, right, one of the things that comes often in conflict in today's discourse with having children, well, it presupposes a robust human future to make sense of my commitment today. And that's true of so many of our activities. If we look through the things that we're invested in that may look like a very simple present activity, we see that in fact we are embracing in that activity the possibility of a robust human future. And so as Rachel was saying, it's, we want to point out there's a false choice between the presentism and the future. We do, however, think that the right corrective right now, at least for the audience we're aiming the book at, is to point out or invite them to think about their own personal futures earlier in life, where they can really make those thoughts count for the decisions that they're going to end up making. And also really realize what I just described, which is how many of the goals that they are happy to affirm without reservation, political goals, reversing climate change, intellectual goals, artistic goals, really presuppose the kind of robust human future that antinatalism simply isn't compatible with.
And then on a personal level, Anastasia, you mentioned this earlier, that the conclusion of the book is written from the other side of the question of having kids, because you've had kids, Rachel hasn't. Let's go there. A lot of people say that they think motherhood is going to completely change who they are, that it's just completely life-changing. You'll be a completely different person. And you say that motherhood didn't really fundamentally change your entire world, and also that you were kind of resisting that change. Talk about the conclusion then, as you we're thinking through from the other side of now having become a mother.
Right. So one of the things I want to introduce is the idea that we can talk about the radical sort of change to your life. My life looks different, without having to couch that change in terms of an identity change. Oftentimes we try and understand the change that happens to a parent, but specifically to a mother in terms of a radical identity transformation, which comes at the expense of her other identities. Now, on the one hand, this is kind of like we're talking about with the novels. On the one hand, this is really an attempt to give pride of place to the experience of motherhood and recognize its challenges in many ways, maybe in a novel way. But on the other hand, it can make the decision and the deliberation around motherhood that much harder to make, because you're now not just facing the challenge of parenthood. You're told that you might not recognize yourself on the other side. That can make it very daunting. And then when you've had your child, but you don't recognize yourself in that narrative, a quite monolithic one sometimes, you might feel like you're doing it wrong. Like, am I not the right kind of mother because I, in fact, still care about the things I care about and still try and pursue my other goals? What I want to introduce is the fact that while children could be it could be hard, it could be challenging, it could be a big force in your life, it can be continuous with the things that you have built up to the point of having the children, including your own self. And in fact, that there's also a horizon for an adult past the point of having very small children. Rachel was telling us how in the motherhood ambivalence novels, we see the portrayal of parenting as strictly concentrated in the first year of life. That's true of a lot of portrayals and representations of parenting today, as if parenting is just parenting an infant. But parenting isn't just parenting an infant. It's also developing a robust relationship with another human being for whom you've taken on those responsibilities. It's having a relationship with adults. Some of the most moving interviews we've had were with people who described to us how fantastic it has been for them to have adult children. They say, that's really my contact with the younger generation goes through those experiences. And we want to show that continuity of having children with a fulfilling, rich adult life. And I want to say that it is possible. It doesn't necessarily make it easier because, like you said, in fact, not giving in totally to this so-called new identity, that is hard in itself, because I could really feel where there was a call to sacrifice or where there was a challenge to integrate, I refuse to give up. I want to try and continue living that fulfilling life, and that could be its own kind of challenge.
One of the biggest challenges you mentioned is the boredom of it. You didn't expect the tedium of it, where you're talking about how you really love the life of the mind and all of these other things, but then you say, oh, but here I am just like up in the middle of the night with a kid that won't go to sleep. They're just crying and crying. And you're just like, some of the tedium has been one of the biggest challenges for you.
I think tedium is one way of describing it. And I think that's very true for many people. And sometimes it's boring for me because it doesn't fully engage you. I think I had some kind of fantasy based on my limited interactions with small children, that I do, that seeing the world through a child's eyes could be very rewarding, and seeing them grow and develop. Like, I'm very interested in human development, so I thought that would be very interesting. And that was all true.
Yeah.
What I didn't quite realize is just how much time you're spending not doing any of those things. You're not playing and you're not observing a child develop.
Yeah.
You really are, the way I think about it is you're kind of like a sponge for displeasure. So I don't mind the quote unquote boringness or tedium as much as I mind the kind of helplessness in helping another being, where the only thing you could do is absorb. The only thing you're supposed to do is hold and walk and try and comfort, but a pretty resistant to comfort kind of being. Yes, that is very hard and that's very difficult. And there, I don't, that if somebody's reading the book with the hope that we can cure that, I don't have a cure for that.
What's the most rewarding thing on the other side of that? Oh, Rachel, did you have something to add to that?
I was just going to say that one of the things that's funny about the conclusion is that, it does not turn a blind eye to some of the hardships of raising a small child, a toddler. But there is something about it that I think is kind of consoling or liberating for someone who hasn't made the decision yet, in that, you can recognize those things, you can acknowledge them without having it necessarily be an indictment of the experience somehow. It can be a way, and it also doesn't have to be some kind of like personal sacrifice or something that's idolized, but that it's part of an experience that will be part of a life, and that it's something you will move through. And that, to me, for someone who does not yet have a child, was actually kind of refreshing to hear.
As to what's actually rewarding about it, if I may, I'm going to do a lofty part of the answer and then a very quotidian one.
Yeah.
And so I think the lofty part of the answer is that I do think that ultimately in having children, it's like you take one for team humanity. So, and I think there are a lot of ways of participating in this project of sustaining our existence. And they include political reform and intellectual pursuit and artistic pursuit and not biological parenting. So you can also be a great godparent and great uncle, and you could do. But one of the ways is to take a responsibility for just a tiny, tiny sliver of this existence, raising a child. And I do genuinely think that part of what redeems so much of what you referred to in the book, when I say it doesn't even have to be me, but it does have to be me. And those kind of moments of frustration is actually that I'm not doing something that is just, explained fully by a list of pros and cons. And that there's something here of tremendous kind of meaning and value. And then on the interpersonal level, I have to really say that even I, who wrote this book and pointed out and criticized the fact that parenting is represented as the parenting of infants, even knowing that theoretically did not fully prepare me for how much in practice seeing your child grow makes a difference to your experience, and just how dynamic the experience of parenting is going to be. When you're a parent of very small, your first small child, people say, don't worry, anything that happens, it changes. Anything that happens, it changes. And that is so true. And so just realizing just how dynamic that experience it is, and then finding out that very quickly you are actually having little conversation with a human being who is discovering the world. I think that is probably the most rewarding thing for me.
So I want to close with this quote from the book that says, if the basic feminist goal is to liberate and empower women, then simply insisting on a woman's right to choose won't do. In other words, it's not enough. So it sounds like a woman's right to choose is important to you as authors, but you want something more than that. Tell me what that is.
Yeah, we want to make space for having open, honest conversations about the value of children and parenthood in a human life. So obviously, individual biological bodily autonomy is an important value and one that we uphold, but that's not going to help you necessarily on a personal basis decide whether or not you want to have children. So that is the space that we are trying to fill with this book and this argument by opening up a conversation between the two of us and with our readers about what it would mean personally, politically, socially, intellectually to have and raise children.
Okay. And that's exactly what this book does. Again, the book is called What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice by Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman. Anastasia Berg is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine, and Rachel Wiseman is managing editor of The Point, which is a magazine of philosophical writing on politics, contemporary life, and culture. All right, now it's time for regrets, challenges, and surprises. This is where you get to reflect on the book itself, something you regret about it now that it's out that you might change about the book, or what the hardest part about writing it was, any challenges you faced, or a surprising revelation that came about because you did this project. You don't have to speak to all three. You can choose. It's up to you.
I'll say, the greatest challenge for us was certainly, I think, the fact that we chose to write it together. And that wasn't just a matter of us happening to want to write together. It felt right, given the themes of the book and the ambition we had for the book, that it should be a live conversation between the two of us. But that is very difficult. Rachel and I have different styles of thinking and different styles of writing. I believe the book is so much better because of that. But for us, I think that was the greatest challenge in trying to figure everything out, but also probably what made the experience just so rewarding and hopefully the book as good as it is.
Were there things that either of you were like, I really don't want that in there, and the other person made a case for it? Like, were there big disagreements over stuff, or was it mostly like in presentation? Or
I don't think there weren't any big things where we had to make cases for should this go in, should this not go in. We were working on kind of like a sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph basis for the vast majority of the book.
This is absolutely not true. I had to fight Rachel very hard to keep many of the things in her personal essay that is the introduction to this book. That is the truth. I thought they were amazing and incredible and really important for showing the readers that we really understand where they're coming from and know in our own experiences how hard and challenging and fraught thinking about having children in one's life could be. And that requires taking a risk. So I had to fight Rachel to make sure that we show we can take the risks that we ask our readers to take as well. Sorry, Rachel, I had to confess that one.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I do think that speaks to something that I was going to say was the biggest, for me, a big challenge in writing the book, which is that we know that this is at once an incredibly personal issue, something that touches on lots of really live wires. It's something that is quite polarizing. At the same time, we wanted to make space, make room for that conversation and to find a way to do so sensitively and analytically, and kind of figuring out how to thread that needle was a big conceptual challenge at the beginning of writing the book.
And it sounds like you felt vulnerable then, Rachel, about the beginning, because it does get very personal about your own sort of searching about and thinking about the question. Do you feel good about it now? I mean, it's in the book now. How are you feeling about the fact that the book does start off with that? Yeah,
I feel good about it. It's interesting rereading it now because I wrote it, 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
4 years ago. And I'm at a different point in my life now. And I've kind of gone through different phases of thinking through the question, attempting to get pregnant. And so that for me, I read it now, and I was worried when I took a little bit of a break from it that it would feel like I no longer recognized the person who was writing. And I did. I recognized it as me, but a kind of earlier version of me.
That's an important point in itself, because I feel like that's the journey that a lot of people experience. And also people that deal with infertility or that maybe have made up their mind and then have to go through the process of grieving something that they've figured out they did want. Or there's so many different paths that different people can take. And I feel like your book really tries to make room for a lot of those different paths in a way that also thinks positively about the possibility of having children as a good thing. And like you said, I think that's a lesser focus, especially in the progressive and liberal spaces. So having a book like this is really valuable so that people can really think about that part of the conversation, because I do think it's kind of under the radar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blair.
Yeah, again, the book is called What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice by Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman. Anastasia, thanks for spending the time with us talking about the book.
Thank you so much for having us.
And Rachel, again, thank you for putting yourself out there. It's a great book.
I was so glad we got to do this. Thank you, Blair.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes. And if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you go rate and review it. You can do that in Apple Podcasts. Just look up the show, scroll down. There's a rate and review section. Click that. I love seeing new reviews come in, like this one from G. Pauliot. I don't know how to pronounce that. G. Pauliot. They say, many podcasts succeed by offering the same thing over and over. Blair brings in guests from a broad spectrum of viewpoints and topics that keeps the variety interesting with agility and grace. Thanks for that review, G. Pauliot. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. I hope other people will go rate and review the show so I can mispronounce their name on the show as well. You can also rate the show on Spotify, by the way, if that's where you're listening, and that's easier to do. You just go hit the stars. Mates of State provides our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, a journalist in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you next time.